Hi, I'm Alan Ross. I'm the managing editor of APC Media. This is DISTRIBUTECH International 2024 Interviews with Thought Leaders. Enjoy. My next guest is Ross Dueber. Ross is the CEO of Powerside.
That's correct.
I got to get that right,
Yep.
But we're going to talk about Powerside in a minute. First of all, tell me a little bit about your background in the power industry, how you got in it, why you got in it, and how did you endure in it?
Yeah, so my career actually started, I was in the Air Force.
Okay.
And so my power background, originated Strategic Defense Initiative.
Wow.
And the Star Wars program. So how are we going to get all of this power either off the ground or into space in order to, of course, provide defense, the shield over the United States? So I worked on a number of esoteric systems from nuclear reactors for space to battery systems to fuel cells. And then a lot of that work actually translated to ground-based, what the Air Force was doing. So, at one time we had nuclear reactors on Air Force bases, or we were deploying fuel cells. So
we really did, or we
did.
Okay.
Yeah, that was part of a program the military had, small modular reactors from that period. So that's how I got my foot in the door, so to say, in the industry.
And then you went from that, now you're in Powerside. What is that? Did you start it?
No, I progressed through. So I spent some time in academia and doing research and development into battery systems, for example. Did my work at Oxford University, where the lithium ion was invented. So, two of the Nobel Prize winners were from my lab. So I got into battery energy storage that way. Then moved from academia. I worked for a company called Emerson Electric. So we were doing a lot of work when I was there in distributed energy resources, DER, so dispatching gen sets, microturbine technology, of course, batteries as well. So we were at the early stages of that in the mid-90s. And then ran a battery startup company for a number of years, and then came over to Powerside about 3 years ago.
Excellent. We're going to talk about Powerside at the end, but you brought me up next to the next question. This industry has not had a lot of change in decades, and all of a sudden, boom, the industry is now undergoing a lot of change. Talk about that, the last 5 years in particular, to where we are now. What are some of the things that you've seen changing? You mentioned storage or batteries 4 times. Mm-hmm. I listened.
Yeah.
That is really, to me, one of the future changes that are going to absolutely revolutionize what we do. But that's only one of them. Talk about where we are right now.
Yeah, if you take a look at what I view as the biggest changes in the last 5 years or so, and the seeds were planted. I mean, the ideas have been there for decades. It's just now the impetus to adopt those ideas. So I take a look at, first of all, how we distribute and generate electricity.
Okay.
So, I mean, we go from our fossil fuel central power plant, now where we look at the majority of new generation coming into this country is from renewables.
Right.
So that by far is in my mind the biggest change is the sources of generation. So as we move beyond, the battery portion of it is equally important. Is now we can actually store energy. Before we never had really a good way of storing energy. So hey, do I take the peaker plants up and down? I maintain baseload generation with coal and nuclear, for example. Now we have much more flexibility, and we have to have that because, again, renewable generation is not necessarily steady state. So combine those two things together in the last 5 years is drastically changed, how we produce the energy and what the system needs to be in place in order to handle that.
I'm on the Grid Edge steering committee for the Grid Edge conference in January 2025 in San Diego. And one of the things that struck me at the last conference in 2022 was what we consider the grid edge, right? Is a renewables plant, a solar plant in a desert, is that part of the grid edge? Well, obviously it is, it's out there, but it's also part of generation. So when the edge of the grid became part of generation, it creates in and of itself an exacerbating problem. And storage is one of the solutions, but there are so many other problems created as a result of that, correctly?
Yeah, certainly as we look at, let's take renewables, solar, wind. These are, of course, not necessarily grid compatible sources, and that meaning it's not the traditional AC 60 hertz.
Right.
These are inverter-based resources, as we call them, IBR, which you're well familiar with. Those particular resources now have added complexity to what's transmitted, both in transmission as well as in distribution, just depending upon where they're connected in at. But the complexity now is leading to, let's say, anomalies in what we see in the consumption for our electricity and for our consumers. And the key aspect of that, of course, is now having visibility, what that's doing, so that we can then correct for it properly.
One of the things that in the inverter-based world that we live in now is the older, I'm a transformer guy, I love transformers, right? They're aging much more rapidly than they have been, and they're already old, and you can't get new ones, right? It's this incredibly complex thing. And part of it is in the inverter-based system, you get a lot more harmonics and transients. They tend to create all kinds of power quality issues, but they also are degrading the current asset structure. Talk a little bit about what you see, because that's where we are now. That's kind of one of the problems that we're going to project on in the future we'll talk about. But how is the industry approaching these kinds of exacerbating changes, whether it comes from IBR or whether it comes from bad actors shooting at transformers, or cyber actors, or good actors like data centers saying, we need this much power. It's so much change we're pushing on the industry today. Okay, how are they dealing with it?
Yeah, so the first step in this is what we've seen, at least, is gaining visibility.
I like that.
Before, we never had to have, let's say, necessarily sensors that would be monitoring some of these assets. And now we begin to see higher failure rates, shorter lifetimes. And you mentioned transformers. That's one of the key things that we do at Powerside, is we can actually measure some of the attributes, power quality attributes, either going into or coming out of the transformer. So for us, at least, the way we view it, and the industry's viewing, is we need visibility first in order to diagnose what is occurring, and then what are the corrective factors that you can do. For example, inverters, all over the map necessarily in terms of who supplied the inverter to what standard, but it also depends upon how many inverters are serving that asset or plugged into that asset. So it becomes a multiplicative effect. Hey, one inverter is not bad, but when you've got 10 of them going through the same, then you can see how that particular synergy, so to say, or duplicative effect is degrading the transformer much more rapidly. So now you get eddy currents, now you get breakdown in insulation, now you begin to see harmonics coming out of the transformer that you didn't see previously that are indicative of that degradation.
And what did those harmonics coming out of the transformer do to the rest of the system? Because I don't think people really understand the danger or the problems or what we're doing. I think they're working on the upside, not the downside. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so as you backfeed the harmonics into the system itself, into the grid, it then begins to proliferate around to the other customers. You can now begin to see things like flickering lights, LED lights, for example, because an LED is, of course, a nonlinear load as well. You begin to see issues with HVAC equipment. You begin to see even just anomalies, such as a harmonic can go through a switch and activate a piece of equipment that you thought was turned off.
Wow, yeah.
So you have to take this all into account now that previously we never had to worry about.
Yeah, creating more problems for both sides of it. Let's switch gears a little bit, because we're talking about now What do you think the next decade looks like for the power industry? And then we'll get into Powerside as part of that, because obviously as the CEO, you got to look ahead and say,
Right.
here's a trajectory, we got to be there. But what do you think the next decade looks like for the industry as a whole?
Yeah, I think as we take a look at it, there's certainly going to be the continuation of the deployment of these new distributed assets, renewables. That is a train that is barreling down the tracks pretty quickly.
Right.
I mean, when we look at it, so that's going to continue over the next decade. I think what you're going to begin to see proliferate even more so is as much as we think those assets are distributed right now, wait till you begin to see how we distribute those assets, let's say down into the residential and the commercial area. So now you begin to look at microgrids, for example, that serve large facilities, large neighborhoods. Again, more self-contained. So it's simply the distribution of assets is just going to multiply greatly, even over what we're used to today. We talk about, hey, a large 200 megawatt solar farm. Well, no, we're going to put a lot of that 200 megawatts and distribute it more closely to the consumption. So we're going to see more and more, closer to the consumption, and we're going to see more and more, let's say battery assets in order to store it such that you have much more diversity in how it goes. And so that's the key for me, is just it's going to proliferate.
So you said a word that I love, storage. Okay, you mentioned it a couple of times, and I think, wind and solar had their, it was like, oh, they're going to come. When storage starts to play a bigger impact on it, now wind and solar is much more viable, because I think the number is set 38% of green energy is used. 62% you can't use because it didn't happen when you needed it. Well, if you can store that 62%, whether that is in large-scale utility storage or whether that's end of the grid or grid edge storage, putting a power wall in somebody's home, you change the whole dynamic of the grid. So talk a little bit, because you said it, you mentioned storage.
Right.
Now you got to tell me about what role storage is going to play in the next decade.
Yeah. So out of necessity, of course, the sun doesn't always shine,
Right.
The wind doesn't always blow. But at the same time, you want to be able to take advantage of it when you're producing it, especially, of course, if it's beyond what the demand is.
Right.
So you store it, and we've done this for decades, with pumped hydro storage, for example. Now we talk about compressed air gas storage. We talk about, kinetic and potential energy storage, thermal storage, of course, and then, of course, traditional batteries,
Right.
Which is the most most deployable today. So as I take a look at how that's going to evolve is, certainly at the utility level, no longer do you just put in a solar or wind. Now it's solar with battery storage, wind with battery
Right,
storage,
right.
or you're going back and retrofitting in order to put these sites in again. So what it gives us the capability is to really take advantage of 24/7 either energy production, or we've got the storage in order to serve the load. So it's not like we're we got to turn peakers on and off anymore, your gas. No, it's okay. I got a level load on this nuclear plant, and then I take advantage maybe of some adjacent green energy that I can then peak with, for example. So it just gives us more tools in our belt, so to say.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And the nice thing about it again is that it's climate friendly.
Yeah,
Which
right.
has not been necessarily the issues in the past.
Oh, we've had a climate problem. We're still struggling with that one.
I'm not a denier, so you can take that as gospel.
We don't interview deniers, right? We got a climate problem, which again exacerbates things, because you got now extreme weather events, not just an event, but now you got heat, and that pervasive heat causes all kinds of problems. But that's a different discussion we have. You said another word I'm going to go back to, another favorite of mine, microgrids. What is the next 10 years for microgrids? Because we happen to believe that it's going to play a big part in the future for people, not to get off the grid. It's not that the utility is an issue, but to be much more self-sustaining. But talk about microgrids for a bit.
Yeah. So it's funny. I first used the term microgrids back in the mid '90s.
Yeah, and everybody did what? They went,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah, they were just around the corner then.
Yeah.
As we looked at it, because we were even talking to companies like McDonald's, for example, at the time, in order to make your own microgrid to service your stores. So we had already gone down to the individual facility.
Wow.
And this was maybe a 60 kW microturbine.
Yeah.
But as you take a look at what it means going forward, it's again giving us more flexibility, giving the customer more flexibility. Keep in mind, we used to think of, hey, I just want to buy electricity. And my core value as a company is I operate, I buy, sell, I make things. Now you have to be more responsible for your energy,
Right.
both its production as well as its consumption. It just has to become part of your business.
Right.
And so as I take a look at microgrids, that is the key enabler that for, let's say, a chief energy officer at a company in order to put those in place such that, hey, look, I'm operating as a supplement to the grid. I'm not a replacement to the grid. Yeah, I can go full, isolated asset if I need to, but I want to be able to have the flexibility to do demand pricing, take advantage of that, demand reduction as well
Right.
if there's an issue with the grid itself trying to. And granted, I've lived in California for years, so I've seen demand reduction, implemented, rather harshly.
Yeah, yeah.
And I had no backup solutions.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about it that way. The demand reduction thing. Utilities will embrace microgrids if we can eliminate that demand reduction, because they can say, look, we're reducing, but you pick up the load. Yeah, it's all about load sharing, load leveling. It's all about that. But the idea that microgrids are going to scale up, I think is going to be a big important part. Let's move on to the last subject, power side. Talk to me about power side today, power side in the future.
Yeah. So Powerside today, we're in the power quality business,
Right.
Which is somewhat of a niche in the industry. We talk about generation and we talk about consumption, but there's that important part of the quality. Am I at the right voltage? Am I at the right frequency? And so for us, we've always specialized in that. Either we measure it in order to understand if it's correct, and then we can correct for it if there is some type of anomaly or problem in the system. So we have both sides of the equation covered, or as we say, detect and correct as we look at it. And what we have done today is primarily we've been a hardware company, Alan.
Right.
Okay, so we make the sensors that can detect issues with power quality, and then we can, of course, provide the necessary equipment in order to correct for that. And it may be as simple as it's a power factor correction issue.
Right.
Or you've got harmonics and you
Right.
want to correct for that. So we can measure what's occurring and then we correct for it. Now, that's what we do today. We've traditionally been a hardware company.
Okay.
Our evolution though, and particularly with power quality, is again, we've been in kind of the shadows, as I call it, even within utilities. It's tough to even find who the power quality experts are. But the data that we're generating, from our power quality measurement standpoint, is a treasure trove of what is going on.
And have you been capturing that data historically?
Yeah.
So you have a nice.
Yeah, we have
Gosh.
we have a really nice, particularly now working with utilities, we have a really nice data set, particularly around some of these newer assets that are deployed.
Oh,
So high megawatt consumption data centers, solar farms, renewables, microgrids, battery energy storage.
Everything I talked about.
Everything there. So you need visibility
Yeah.
for what those are doing at the grid edge.
Yeah.
And in order to understand, is my system stable? How do I enhance the system? What's the degradation of my transformer?
Okay.
All of that data is, as I said, just waiting to be mined and analyzed. So we're just starting those process now in order to take through this tera and petabytes worth of data that we've got that can translate to a better operation of the grid.
No, that's excellent, because an inverter-based world is going to make it worse and worse and worse. There's going to be more and more data. Is this to use the data as a predictive tool to begin to, or as a prescriptive tool? Hey, this is what's going on with your system, or hey, this is what's going to go on with your system. You need to do something.
Yeah, that's the natural evolution of things. So right now, the data has served initially as reactive. So post-mortem, what happened? We can look at those signatures and then correlate that back to a time of day, and then look at it as a particular anomaly that occurred, and then what was the result of it, such that now I learn out of that with the algorithms in order to now become more prescriptive and proactive so that I can see into the future and address issues before they actually pop up.
So last question, because I said the last question, but this one, you said it again, you gave me a word. You're going to be using AI or machine learning. I don't, I think they get close to each other, but you're going to use some way of looking at all this, back testing data to be able to make some determinations about the future. Is it machine learning or AI, or are you building your own algorithms?
Yeah, so certainly those are buzzwords, tools that we all, interchange, and they all sound really cool. It's kind of like nano, back in the day. I try and fit them all together into one.
Like nano. I still like it.
Yeah, you got to love nano.
Yeah.
But as we take a look at it, it's really core data analytics is the key. So you look for correlations, but really the key out of all of it is for the machine through artificial intelligence to learn what we look for. So I train the algorithms based upon what we as individuals see, and then we look to replicate and enhance that going forward, such that if I want to be predictive, it's not just by happenstance that somebody looked at the data or they got an alert. No, it's rather the algorithm itself has been trained to look for something specific. For example, you talked about transformers near and dear to your heart. We're beginning to see signatures coming out of power quality that relate to that degradation. Just by happenstance, somebody drilled down into that data and looked at it. Now, hey, let's train the algorithm to look for this particular signature and be more reactive such that we can get to that transformer before it fails.
I want to do a story on that, okay? I'd like you to write a feature.
Yeah.
You can keep the customer out, but just say, here's what happened, here's what it is, and it's going to be a free promotion for what you're doing. It is hugely needed in the industry because we are so reactive to what's going on with the asset. We're actually going to be doing a feature soon called Let the Equipment Speak. Right? But are we listening?
Yeah.
So anyway, I want you to be part of that.
Look forward to it.
Ross, thank you so much.
Alan, pleasure, sir.